Hello, and welcome, dear listeners, to another quiet evening by the fire. Tonight, I invite you into a story soaked in candlelight and carol song, a story called Miss Marple and Death at the Christmas Soirée. Picture it, a grand old English manor, snow falling softly outside the windows, laughter drifting from room to room, and a glass of mulled wine in every hand. It should have been the merriest night of the year, but somewhere between the toasts and the tinsel, a wealthy guest is found lifeless in the library, and what looks, at first, like nothing more than one drink too many, is about to become something far darker, because even the warmest Christmas gathering can hide a killer who knows exactly how to smile while striking. So pour yourself something warm, settle into your chair, and let us step quietly into that soirée together, where, somewhere among the carolers, sits a sharp-eyed old lady with her knitting, and she has already begun to notice. Let's begin. Arrival at Faringdon Hall. The snow had begun to fall in earnest by the time the taxi turned in through the iron gates of Faringdon Hall, and Miss Jane Marple, wrapped snugly in her good grey coat with the fur collar that had once belonged to her mother, peered out at the great house with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had spent a lifetime noticing things other people overlooked. It was, she thought, a very handsome house indeed, Georgian in its bones, though someone with more money than taste had added a conservatory to the east wing sometime in the last century, and the effect was rather like a duchess wearing a paper hat. Warm light spilled from every window onto the snow, and somewhere within, a gramophone was playing carols with the particular tinny cheerfulness that gramophones reserve for Christmas. "Here we are then, madam," said the taxi driver, and Miss Marple thanked him, paid the fare with the small exactness of a woman who had never in her life overpaid for anything, and made her way up the steps with her overnight case in one gloved hand. She had been invited, as she frequently was at Christmas time, by her nephew Raymond's old university friend, or rather, by that friend's wife, a pleasant, if somewhat scattered young woman named Cynthia Fortescue, who had once stayed a fortnight in St. Mary Mead, recovering from influenza, and had never quite lost the habit of writing to Miss Marple twice a year. It was Cynthia who opened the door herself, flushed with the warmth of the hall and the excitement of hosting. "Miss Marple, how perfectly lovely! Do come in out of the cold. Henry, take Miss Marple's case. There's a dear. We're all in the drawing room, though I warn you, it's rather a crush this year. My husband's uncle has decided we simply must have everyone." The drawing room, when Miss Marple was ushered into it, was indeed a crush, though a very well-dressed and glittering one. A fire roared in the great stone hearth. Holly and ivy had been wound round the picture frames with more enthusiasm than skill, and a tree, laden with glass baubles that caught the firelight, stood in the bay window. There were perhaps 14 or 15 people gathered in little knots of conversation, and Miss Marple, accepting a small glass of sherry from a passing maid, settled herself in a wing chair by the fire, not the most comfortable chair in the room, but, as she had long ago discovered, the one from which a person could see and hear the most, while appearing to do neither. It was Cynthia's husband, Gerald Fortescue, who made the introductions, moving round the room with his glass in hand and a genial, slightly harried air. "Miss Marple, you must meet my uncle, Uncle Selwyn. This is Miss Marple, a friend of Cynthia's." The gentleman who turned at this was tall, heavily built, with a florid complexion and the sort of confident, booming manner that fills a room, whether the room wishes to be filled or not. Selwyn Carrick, Miss Marple gathered from the subsequent conversation, was Gerald's uncle by marriage, a widower who had made a very great deal of money in shipping, and who now divided his time, as far as she could tell, between his London club and the making of pronouncements. "Delighted, delighted," he said, barely glancing at her, his eye already moving on to the sherry tray. "Cynthia tells me you're from some village or other." "Charming, charming. Gerald, is there any of that good brandy left, or has young Tom got at it again?" There was a small ripple at this, nothing so definite as a silence, but a kind of pause, a held breath, and Miss Marple's eyes, mild and blue and entirely unremarkable, moved without apparent interest to the young man standing near the window. Tom Carrick was, she gathered over the course of the evening. Selwyn's nephew, the son of a brother who had died some years before, and who had, by all appearances, been left rather awkwardly dependent on his uncle's goodwill. He was a good-looking young man in the way that young men often are before life has had time to disappoint them. But there was a tightness about his mouth when his uncle spoke that Miss Marple, who had seen a great deal of tightness about mouths in her long life, filed away with the same care she gave to an unusual stitch in her knitting. "I haven't touched your brandy, Uncle Selwyn," said Tom, and his voice was perfectly pleasant, perfectly light, and perfectly false, in the way that voices are when a great deal of feeling is being held very firmly in check. "No, of course not, my boy. Only my little joke," said Selwyn, and laughed, and clapped him on the shoulder in a manner that somehow contrived to be both affectionate and faintly humiliating, and moved on to greet someone else. Miss Marple sipped her sherry, and looked, with an air of gentle vagueness, about the room. There was Cynthia's sister-in-law, a striking dark woman called Delia Renshaw, dressed in emerald green, who was talking with great animation to a quiet, sandy-haired man Miss Marple had not yet been introduced to, and who had the look, Miss Marple could not have said precisely why, of a woman performing gaiety rather than feeling it. There was Dr. Haverford, the local physician, a stout, comfortable man who had clearly known the family a long time, and was at present engaged in a loud and cheerful argument about the coming general election, with a thin, disapproving lady in violet, who must, Miss Marple decided, be the vicar's wife. There was a girl of perhaps 20, very pretty, very anxious, hovering near the door, as though uncertain whether she was meant to be at this gathering at all, whom Cynthia presently identified, in a low aside, as poor little Susan Carrick, Selwyn's niece, you know, quite penniless. He's been dreadfully good to her, taking her in and all that, though I must say he does rather remind her of it. And there, by the window, in earnest and rather too intimate conversation with the sandy-haired man, was Delia Renshaw, whose husband, Miss Marple noted, was nowhere in the room at all. It was, on the whole, a very pleasant party, Miss Marple reflected, settling back in her chair with the particular contentment of an old woman among young people's noise. The fire crackled. The carols played. Someone laughed too loudly at one of Selwyn Carrick's jokes, and someone else did not laugh at all. She had been to a great many Christmas parties in her long life, and she had noticed, though she would not for the world have said so aloud, it not being the sort of thing one said at a party, that they were, in their way, rather like her garden in high summer, full of the most beautiful blooms, and every so often, quite unexpectedly, one found a wasp. She wondered, not for any particular reason, only out of the habit of a lifetime's small curiosity, what Mr. Selwyn Carrick's will might say, and who, among this glittering, laughing company, stood to gain the most by his sudden and untimely absence from it. It was, of course, only an idle thought, the kind an old lady has, by the fire, on Christmas Eve. She had no notion, as yet, how very soon it would matter. Before the Gong dinner was not for another hour, and the party had begun to shift and eddy about the drawing-room in the way that parties do once the first sherry has been drunk and tongues have loosened just enough. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that the most interesting hour of any gathering was very often the one before dinner rather than the meal itself, remained in her wing chair by the fire and allowed the room to come to her. It was Dr. Haverford who came first, settling his stout frame into the neighbouring chair with a comfortable grunt. "You'll be Cynthia's friend from the country," he said. "She mentioned you were coming. I'm the local sawbones, Haverford, known this family donkey's years, knew Gerald's father matter-of-fact before him." "How very pleasant," said Miss Marple, "to have a doctor one has known so long. It makes such a difference, I always think, to be attended by someone who remembers one as a child, rather than some brisk young man fresh from his examinations who looks at one as though one were a set of symptoms rather than a person." Dr. Haverford laughed, a comfortable rumbling laugh. "Well, I don't know that old Selwyn thinks much of me either way. Difficult man. Between ourselves. Very difficult man." He glanced, as he said it, toward the far end of the room. where Selwyn Carrick's voice could be heard rising above the general chatter, laying down the law on some point of shipping tariffs to a gentleman who had the glazed and patient look of a man being lectured against his will, made his money hard, and doesn't let anyone forget it. Especially not that nephew of his, the young man by the window. Tom, I think Cynthia called him. That's the one. Selwyn's brother's boy. Father died in debt, poor fellow, and Selwyn took the lad in. Very generous of him. And doesn't he know it? Trouble is, generosity that's forever being totted up on a ledger doesn't feel much like generosity to the one receiving it. He shook his head. Still, none of my business. Ah, there's the gong. Shall we go through? Dinner was announced with the particular solemnity that only a very good butler can produce, and the company began, in twos and threes, to make its way toward the dining room. Miss Marple, rising with the small stiffness of a lady of advancing years, a stiffness she had learned to use, on occasion, as a very useful excuse for lingering a moment behind the general crowd, found herself for a brief instant alone in the drawing-room doorway with Susan Carrick, the pretty, anxious girl she had noticed earlier. "I do hope you're enjoying yourself," said Susan, with the overly bright politeness of the very nervous. It's rather a large party this year." "I am enjoying myself a great deal, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "though I confess a room full of strangers can be a little overwhelming, even for those of us who ought by now to be quite used to parties." "Oh, yes." Susan's eyes flickered, quite involuntarily, toward the dining room, where Selwyn Carrick's voice could still be heard. "Uncle Selwyn does like a large gathering. He says it isn't Christmas without a full table." She hesitated, then added in a rush, as though the words had escaped before she could stop them. "Though I sometimes think he only likes it because it gives him more people to—" She stopped herself. "To," said Miss Marple gently. "Nothing. I oughtn't to have said anything at all. It's only that living with Uncle Selwyn is—well, it's a great kindness, of course, and I'm dreadfully grateful, only—" Susan gave a small, unhappy laugh. "He does like to remind one, that's all. Do come in to dinner, Miss Marple. I'm keeping you standing about in the draught." They went in together, and Miss Marple, taking her seat at the long table between Dr. Haverford and a rather deaf elderly gentleman who turned out to be a retired colonel, reflected that she had, in the space of one short conversation, learned 3 things of interest: that Susan Carrick was afraid of her uncle, that she was ashamed of being afraid of him, and that she had very nearly said something she thought better of. The table was a handsome one, decked with silver and holly, and Cynthia had clearly gone to a great deal of trouble. But Miss Marple, sipping her soup, allowed her gaze to travel gently round the assembled company, as an artist's eye might travel round a room, cataloguing not the furniture, but the small, telling gestures of the people in it. Selwyn Carrick sat at the head of the table, in high good humour, a large glass of claret at his elbow, holding forth to the table at large about a business rival of his, who had, apparently, come rather badly to grief that autumn. "Ruined, my dear fellow, absolutely ruined," he was saying, with the particular relish some men bring to the misfortunes of others. "And serve him right, too. Thought he could undercut me on the Baltic contracts. I told Fortescue here, I said, give a man enough rope, and Meredith's given himself a very great deal of rope indeed." He laughed heartily at his own wit, and 1 or 2 of the guests laughed with him, though Miss Marple noticed that Delia Renshaw's laugh, from further down the table, did not reach her eyes at all. "You're very hard on your competitors, Uncle Selwyn," said Tom Carrick, from further along, in a voice that was light, but carried, Miss Marple thought, a small and deliberate edge. "Hard? Nonsense, my boy. Business is business. If I'd been soft, you wouldn't have a roof over your head, would you?" And Selwyn Carrick laughed again, and reached for his claret, entirely unaware, or entirely unconcerned, that his nephew's knuckles had gone white round the stem of his own glass. There was a small, uncomfortable pause, into which Cynthia, with the practised skill of a hostess who has navigated 1,000 such moments, inserted a bright remark about the pudding, and the talk moved on. But Miss Marple, who noticed such things as other people noticed the weather, had seen the look that passed, In that pause, between Delia Renshaw and the quiet, sandy-haired man beside her, a look of such swift, silent understanding that it might almost have been a sentence spoken aloud. She had also seen Selwyn Carrick catch that same look out of the corner of his eye and smile, a small, private, satisfied smile, quite unlike his usual booming good humour, before turning back to his claret. It was, Miss Marple thought, rather like watching a hand of cards being played by 4 people who each believed themselves the only one who could see all the cards on the table. And she had learned, over a very long life, spent largely in the observation of her fellow creatures, that a man who smiles privately at another person's discomfort is, as often as not, a man collecting something, a grievance, a debt, a piece of knowledge, to be spent later, and to his own very great advantage. She could not, of course, have said at that moment what Selwyn Carrick knew, or thought he knew, about Delia Renshaw and the quiet, sandy-haired gentleman, but she filed the small private smile away, along with the tightness round Tom Carrick's mouth, and Susan's unfinished sentence, in the neat and capacious pigeonholes of her memory, in very much the way she filed away the small deviations of her neighbours in St. Mary Mead, the vicar's wife, who suddenly took to buying twice the usual quantity of fish, the churchwarden's daughter, who had, quite unaccountably, given up the piano, deviations which so very often, on closer inspection, told one a great deal more than anybody had intended to tell. The pudding was brought in, blazing handsomely with brandy, to general applause. The crackers were pulled, and paper hats were donned with the particular determined jollity of the English at Christmas. And if Miss Marple, beneath her own paper crown, a rather becoming one, in blue, continued to watch the table with a mild and grandmotherly interest that concealed an attention of really quite remarkable sharpness, no one at Faringdon Hall that evening thought anything of it at all, which was, as it would later prove, rather a pity for one person in that room, though which person not even Miss Marple could yet have said. Paper hats and private smiles. The paper hats came off eventually, as paper hats always must, and the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room in the old-fashioned way that Selwyn Carrick, as head of the family for the evening, insisted upon. "None of your modern nonsense. We'll keep to the old customs in my house, thank you," leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars. Miss Marple, finding herself once more in the drawing-room among the ladies, took up a position near the fire with her knitting. She had brought it down from her room while dressing for dinner, a small grey scarf of no particular urgency, which served her, as it had served her for the better part of 50 years, as an excellent excuse for sitting quietly in a corner, with her eyes lowered to her needles and her ears very much open. "You mustn't mind, Uncle Selwyn," Cynthia was saying to the vicar's wife, in the tone of a woman apologizing for the weather. "He's dreadfully generous, you know, underneath it all. It's only that he does so like to be thanked for it, and Tom's proud, poor boy, and doesn't thank easily." "I should have thought," said the vicar's wife, whose name Miss Marple had now gathered was Mrs. Pemberton, and whose disapproval seemed to extend to the entire proceedings, "that a man in Tom Carrick's position might learn a little humility, living on his uncle's charity as he does." "Oh, but it isn't charity, exactly," said Delia Renshaw from the sofa, with a brittle little laugh. "Uncle Selwyn does love to call it charity. It makes the giving so much sweeter for him, don't you find? Rather like a man who gives a starving dog a bone and then stands over it to watch it eat." There was a small startled silence at this, and Cynthia laughed rather too quickly and said something about more coffee, and the conversation moved determinedly onto safer ground. The vicar's forthcoming charity bazaar, the shocking price of Christmas geese this year, whether the snow would lie until Boxing Day. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, reflected that Delia Renshaw was a woman under some strain that had very little to do with Christmas geese. It was perhaps 20 minutes later that the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, in a cloud of cigar smoke and the particular loud bonhomie that port produces in men who have had rather too much of it. Selwyn Carrick came in first, flushed and expansive, and made straight for the sofa where Delia Renshaw sat. "Well, Delia, my dear," he said, and there was something in his voice, a kind of relish, Miss Marple thought, quite separate from ordinary Christmas good humor. "I hear congratulations may be in order before very long. Is that not so, Mr. Ainsworth?" He turned this last to the sandy-haired man, who had followed him into the room and gone rather pale. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Carrick," said Ainsworth stiffly. "Don't you, my boy? Don't you indeed?" Selwyn Carrick smiled his small, private smile, the one Miss Marple had marked at dinner, and reached for a fresh glass from the tray a maid was carrying round. "Well, well, a man in my position hears a great many things. One does, you know, when one has interests in a great many places. Solicitors' offices, for instance. Very interesting places, solicitors' offices, if a man has the right connections there." Delia Renshaw had gone quite white. "Uncle Selwyn, I really don't think—" "No, no, my dear, say no more. I shall say no more myself." He patted her hand in a manner that made the gesture somehow worse than an accusation would have been. "A man in my position learns to be discreet, very discreet, but I shall want a word with you before the evening's out, Mr. Ainsworth. All the same, purely a business matter." He laughed, took a long swallow of his drink, and moved away toward the fire, leaving Delia Renshaw sitting rigid on the sofa, and Ainsworth staring after him with an expression that Miss Marple, glancing up briefly from her knitting, thought she had seen before, not in a drawing-room, but many years ago, in a dock, on the face of a man about to be sentenced. It was, of course, no business of hers. But Miss Marple had lived a great many years in a great many drawing-rooms, and she had noticed, as one notices the first small cracks in a piece of ice before the whole surface gives way, that Selwyn Carrick appeared to be a man who took a very particular pleasure in knowing things about people that those people did not wish known, and in letting them see, just enough, that he knew. Whatever it was he knew about Mrs. Renshaw and Mr. Ainsworth, it was plainly something a great deal more serious than an idle flirtation. Tom Carrick had come in with the other gentlemen, but had not joined the general company. He stood a little apart by the window, looking out at the falling snow with his hands thrust into his pockets, and his shoulders set in the particular hunched line of a young man holding on to his temper by main force. Miss Marple, folding her knitting for a moment, made her way across the room on the pretext of admiring the Christmas tree, and found herself, quite naturally, beside him. "A very fine tree," she said comfortably, "though I always think the baubles look their best from a little distance, in the firelight, rather than up close. Up close one sees the little chips and flaws, and it rather spoils the effect." Tom glanced at her, startled out of his thoughts, and something in her round, mild, faintly foolish old face seemed to reassure him, for he gave a short, unhappy laugh. "That's rather a good way of putting it, actually. My uncle's a bit like that too, if you want to know. Very fine from a distance." "I gathered," said Miss Marple gently, "that he can be a little trying." "Trying?" Tom's laugh had no humor in it at all. "He holds every penny he's ever given me over my head, like the sword of Damocles, Miss Marple. Do you know what he said to me not an hour before dinner? He said if I didn't buck my ideas up about this job I've applied for in the city, he'd be reconsidering his will, as if I were a dog that hadn't fetched the stick fast enough." He stopped himself, coloured slightly, and said, in quite a different tone, "I beg your pardon. I oughtn't to burden you with all that. It's Christmas Eve." "My dear boy," said Miss Marple, "I have found, in a long life, that Christmas Eve is very often the evening on which people say the truest things, precisely because they have spent the whole day being determinedly merry, and have simply run out of the strength to keep it up any longer." She smiled at him, and patted his arm with a small gloved hand. "Don't trouble yourself about having spoken frankly to an old woman. I assure you I shall think none the less of you for it, and a great deal less of your uncle, if it is any comfort to you at all." Tom looked at her properly then, and something in his face eased very slightly, as though he had expected censure, and found, instead, an unexpected ally. Across the room, Selwyn Carrick had settled himself in the best armchair by the fire, with a fresh glass of punch in his hand. The Christmas punch, mulled and spiced, that had been brought round on a silver tray and which he had declared, loudly, to be the finest thing Cynthia had produced all evening, and was holding forth once more, this time to the deaf colonel, about the iniquities of the shipping unions. It was the last time, though none of them yet knew it, that anyone would see Selwyn Carrick fully and entirely himself, loud, expansive, thoroughly pleased with his own cleverness, and entirely unaware that somewhere in that warm, firelit, tinsel-hung room, someone had begun, very quietly, to run out of patience with him altogether. The punch-glass. By 10 o'clock, the party had reached that particular pitch of warmth and noise that marks the high tide of any successful evening. The gramophone had given way to Cynthia at the piano, and a small group had gathered round to sing carols, with more enthusiasm than accuracy. The fire had been made up twice. Someone had produced a box of crackers left over from dinner, and there was a great deal of laughter over the paper hats and the small tin trinkets, and the appalling jokes read aloud from little slips of paper. Miss Marple, who had a very pleasant contralto voice that she used sparingly, and to good effect, joined in "Good King Wenceslas" with real enjoyment, while continuing, in the part of her mind that never entirely went off duty, to observe. She observed that Delia Renshaw had not sung a note, but sat very still on the sofa with a glass of the mulled punch untouched in her hand, her eyes following her husband's absence about the room with the particular fixed attention of a woman keeping watch. For Miss Marple had gathered, in the course of the evening's small conversations, that Mr. Renshaw, a solicitor it seemed, and by all accounts a decent, unremarkable, rather dull sort of man, had come with his wife, but had spent a great deal of the evening in a distant corner, playing chess with the retired colonel, and appeared to have noticed nothing at all of the currents flowing so visibly around him. She observed that Selwyn Carrick's good humour had, if anything, increased as the evening wore on and the punch bowl emptied, and that this increase in good humour seemed to correspond rather precisely with a decrease in good humour among several other members of the party. He had drawn Mr. Ainsworth aside once more, near the window, for a low conversation that had left the younger man looking, when it was over, considerably older than he had at the start of the evening. He had made, twice, remarks to Tom Carrick about the boy's prospects that were dressed as jokes and landed as blows, and once, passing Susan Carrick where she stood near the punch bowl, he had said something to her. Miss Marple did not catch the words, only the effect, which was to make the girl set down her glass rather suddenly and turn away toward the window with her colour high. It was, Miss Marple reflected, watching him hold court by the fire with his glass of punch newly refilled. Rather remarkable how a man could be so entirely blind to the fact that he was disliked. Or perhaps, she thought, folding a fresh line of grey wool over her needle, not blind at all. Perhaps he knew it very well indeed, and simply did not care, or worse, rather enjoyed it, in the way that some men enjoy the sensation of power a great deal more than they enjoy the sensation of being loved, having perhaps concluded somewhere along the way that they cannot have both, and settled, quite deliberately, for the one that lasts longer. The carols wound down into a comfortable lull. Someone put a dance record on the gramophone instead, and 2 or 3 of the younger people began, rather self-consciously, to dance in the cleared space before the fire. Cynthia came away from the piano, flushed and pleased with the evening's success, and Miss Marple, watching her cross the room, thought what a very great pity it was that so much trouble had been taken over an evening that seemed determined, in its quiet undercurrents, to go so badly wrong. It was a little after 10:30 when Selwyn Carrick rose from his chair, glass in hand, and announced, in the manner of a man conferring a favour upon the company by informing them of his movements, that he was going along to the library. "Got a letter I must finish before the post goes out in the morning," he said. "Business doesn't keep Christmas, more's the pity. Don't let me interrupt the dancing. I shan't be above 20 minutes. He took up the punch-glass from the small table beside his chair, and Miss Marple noticed. She could not afterward have said why she noticed it, except that noticing was, by then, so thoroughly a habit with her that she noticed a great many things of no apparent significance at all, that it was a fresh glass, poured not 5 minutes before by the maid from the depleted punch bowl, and that Selwyn Carrick took it with him as he left the room. The door closed behind him. The dance record played on. Nobody remarked upon his going at all, beyond Cynthia's murmured, "He does work such dreadful hours, even at Christmas," and the conversation, unburdened for the first time that evening of his booming presence, seemed to Miss Marple to loosen very slightly, like a room in which a window has at last been opened. She saw Delia Renshaw exchange a single glance with Mr. Ainsworth across the room, a glance of such naked relief that it was, in its way, more revealing than anything either of them had said all evening. She saw Tom Carrick, standing near the fire, drain his glass rather quickly and set it down with more force than the gesture strictly required. She saw Susan Carrick slip quietly out through the door that led toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen passage, Miss Marple supposed, or perhaps only toward a few minutes' solitude away from a room that had grown, for her, rather too warm. And she saw, though this she thought little of at the time, filing it away with the same automatic care she gave to everything else, that Dr. Haverford, glancing at the clock on the mantel, remarked to the vicar's wife that it was getting on, and that he oughtn't to have much more of Cynthia's excellent punch, doctor's orders being doctor's orders even at Christmas, and went to refill his coffee cup instead. The dance ended. Another began. 10 minutes passed, and then 15, in the ordinary small pleasures of a party well advanced. Laughter, a spilled glass hastily mopped up, an argument about a wireless quiz program, the particular comfortable murmur of a room full of people enjoying themselves, or nearly all of them. It was Cynthia who first looked at the clock and said, with the faint anxiety of a good hostess, "I do hope Uncle Selwyn hasn't fallen asleep over his letter. Gerald, be a dear and go and see if he'd like some more punch brought through." Gerald Fortescue, good-natured and a little flushed himself with the evening's cheer, went off toward the library with his glass still in his hand, and was gone rather longer than the errand seemed to warrant. When he came back, he was not flushed at all. He was very white, and he stood in the doorway of the drawing-room for a moment, as though he had forgotten how to speak, and the gramophone played on obliviously behind him, until someone, it was Dr. Haverford, saw his face and crossed the room in 3 quick strides and said, "Gerald, man, what is it?" "It's Uncle Selwyn," said Gerald Fortescue, in a voice quite unlike his own. Haverford, I think you'd better come. I think he's dead." The music stopped. Somewhere, absurdly, a dropped cracker trinket rolled across the floor and came to rest against the leg of the piano, and in the sudden terrible silence of the room, Miss Marple set down her knitting very quietly upon her lap and rose to her feet. The library, cold and still. The library at Faringdon Hall was a long, handsome room, lined floor to ceiling, with books that Miss Marple privately suspected had been bought by the yard rather than read, and it was very cold, for the fire in the grate had burned low, and no one had thought to make it up since Selwyn Carrick had gone in there alone. A single lamp burned on the great mahogany desk, and it was there, sprawled back in his chair with his head fallen at an angle that no living man's head ever assumed, that Selwyn Carrick lay. Dr. Haverford reached him first, and there was a long moment of terrible silence while he bent over the body, his fingers at the wrist, then at the throat, his stout, comfortable face gone suddenly grave and professional in a way that stripped away, all at once, the genial old family friend of an hour before and revealed the physician beneath. "He's dead," said Dr. Haverford at last, straightening up. "Been dead. A little while, I should think. 10 minutes, perhaps a quarter of an hour." Behind him, crowded in the doorway, the party stood frozen in their paper hats and their evening finery, staring into the room with the particular horrified fascination of people who have never before seen death and do not yet know what to do with their faces. "But how?" said Cynthia, her voice very small. "He can't simply. Uncle Selwyn was perfectly well at dinner. He was laughing not half an hour ago. His heart, perhaps," said Dr. Haverford slowly, though there was something in his tone that did not quite match the words. A carefulness, Miss Marple thought, watching him from just inside the doorway, of a man saying the easy thing while his mind worked at something a good deal less easy. He'd had a great deal of punch this evening, a man of his age, his weight. It puts a strain on the heart that a younger man mightn't feel. Then it was an accident, said Gerald Fortescue, with the eagerness of a man grasping at the kindest available explanation. Too much punch, too much excitement, Christmas Eve, and all the business talk he would insist on, even at a party. Perhaps, said Dr. Haverford, but he did not look at Gerald as he said it. He was looking, instead, at the glass that stood on the desk at Selwyn Carrick's elbow, the fresh glass of punch the dead man had carried from the drawing-room not 20 minutes before, and Miss Marple, following his gaze, saw that it was still very nearly full. A man taken suddenly ill from too much drink, she reflected, generally has the grace to have drunk rather more of it first. I think, said Dr. Haverford, turning to face the room, and his voice had taken on, quite suddenly, an authority that silenced the murmur of shocked conversation at once, that nobody had better touch anything in this room. Gerald, I think you had better telephone the police. The police? Cynthia's hand went to her throat. Surely you don't think— I think, said Dr. Haverford carefully, that I am not yet certain what killed your husband's uncle, Mrs. Fortescue, and that until I am certain, it is a good deal wiser to be careful than to be sorry. I am sorry to spoil your Christmas Eve, but there it is. There was a silence in which the full weight of his words settled slowly over the room, and Miss Marple, standing quietly by the door with her hands folded before her, watched the faces of the company with the particular attention of a woman who had spent a very long lifetime learning that it is in the first unguarded moment after a shock that people's faces tell the truth their voices have not yet had time to arrange. She saw Delia Renshaw go white to the lips and reach, blindly, for her husband's arm, and saw Mr. Renshaw, dull, decent, unremarkable Mr. Renshaw, put his hand over hers with a gentleness that suggested he understood a great deal more about his wife's evening than he had let on at the chessboard. She saw Tom Carrick standing very still, his face carefully, deliberately blank, the blankness, Miss Marple thought, of a young man exercising enormous self-control over an expression that wished very much to be something else, though whether that something else was grief, or relief, or a horror at his own relief, she could not yet have said. She saw Susan Carrick, who had come back into the room only moments before from wherever she had gone, standing white and shaking by the door, and heard her say, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, I only went to fetch a handkerchief from my room. I was gone perhaps 10 minutes, no more, though nobody had asked her where she had been at all. And she saw Mr. Ainsworth, the quiet, sandy-haired man, standing a little apart from the rest, with an expression on his face that was not shock, nor grief, nor even guilt precisely, but something closer to the dazed, disbelieving look of a man who has spent the evening dreading one catastrophe and has been ambushed, instead, by an entirely different one. Gerald Fortescue went to telephone the police, his footsteps echoing away down the hall, and in the library, Dr. Haverford, with the careful economy of a man who has performed this particular unhappy task before, drew a rug from the back of a chair and laid it gently over the body of Selwyn Carrick, hiding from the room the sight of that heavy, florid face gone suddenly so still and so strange. I think, he said, straightening, that everyone had better go through to the drawing-room and wait there quietly until the police arrive. I am so very sorry. I know this is a dreadful shock, on Christmas Eve of all nights. The company began, slowly, unwillingly, to file out, a party in paper hats and evening dress, subdued now into a silence that was somehow more dreadful than the earlier horror had been, and Miss Marple, hanging back for one moment longer than the rest, allowed her gaze to travel once more round the darkened library. The low fire, the lamp on the desk, the nearly full glass of punch standing untouched beside a dead man's hand, and the small, ordinary, telling things of a room in which, she was already very nearly certain, though she would not for the world have said so to anybody yet, someone had committed murder, and dressed it very carefully in the ordinary clothes of an accident. She thought of the smile she had seen Delia Renshaw give Mr. Ainsworth as Selwyn Carrick left the room. She thought of Tom Carrick's white knuckles round his glass at dinner, and Susan's unfinished sentence in the doorway, and the small private smile that had crossed Selwyn Carrick's face when he thought no one was watching him watch other people's discomfort. She thought, too, and this she found, on reflection, rather the most troubling thought of all, that whoever had done this dreadful thing had done it with a coolness and a patience that suggested not a sudden loss of temper, but a plan, and a plan very carefully fitted, like a key to a lock, to the particular shape of an ordinary Christmas Eve, in which a disliked and unguarded old man might, quite naturally, be expected to drink rather more punch than was good for him, and nobody would think very much of it at all. It was, she thought, following the rest of the party slowly back toward the drawing-room, going to be a very interesting Christmas indeed, and she found herself, not for the first time in her long career of noticing things other people preferred not to notice, extremely glad that she had brought her knitting. Questions in the study. The police, when they arrived some 3/4 of an hour later, delayed by the snow, which had by now begun to fall thick and steady over the hall and the surrounding lanes, proved to be in the person of a detective inspector named Curtis, a lean, sandy-haired man of perhaps 40, with a notebook, a cold, and an expression of a man who had confidently expected a quiet Christmas Eve and had been very much disappointed in that expectation. He was accompanied by the local police surgeon, who spent some 20 minutes closeted in the library and emerged, looking a good deal graver than Dr. Haverford had looked on his own examination. "Poison," Miss Marple heard him say to the inspector, in the hall outside the drawing-room, in a voice pitched, no doubt, to be discreet, but which carried very well indeed to a small, grey-haired old lady sitting quietly just inside the drawing-room door with her knitting. "I can't be certain of the exact agent without a proper post-mortem, but the symptoms are consistent, and Dr. Haverford agrees with me. Something added to the punch, almost certainly. There's a bitter residue in the glass that oughtn't to be there. Whoever did it knew what they were about. It's not one of your common household poisons, Inspector. Something rather more particular than that. Meaning? Meaning it wasn't done on the spur of the moment with what happened to be in the medicine cabinet. Somebody came to this party prepared. The party, what remained of it, for the vicar's wife and one or two of the more distant guests had been permitted, after their statements were taken, to be driven home through the snow, sat now in the drawing-room, in a silence broken only by the occasional soft crackle of the dying fire and the small, methodical questions of Inspector Curtis, conducted one by one in Gerald Fortescue's study across the hall. Miss Marple, who had given her own statement early, she had, after all, very little to tell that the inspector could not have gathered from anyone else in the room, having spent the crucial 10 minutes before the discovery of the body doing nothing more suspicious than singing carols and finishing a row of grey wool, was permitted to return to the drawing-room, where she resumed her seat and her knitting with the particular patient stillness of a woman who intends to miss nothing at all. It was Cynthia who came to sit beside her, pale and exhausted, her earlier bright hostess manner quite collapsed. "I can't believe it," she said low. "I keep thinking I shall wake up, and it will still be 9:30, and none of this will have happened." "Miss Marple, you don't think, you can't think, it was one of us." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I am afraid that is very often exactly what one must think in cases of this kind. Poison is not a burglar's weapon, nor a stranger's. It requires a very particular sort of opportunity, to know a man's habits, to know what he will drink and when, to be present at the moment the fatal dose is administered, without appearing to be present at all. I am afraid it is very rarely anyone but a member of the household, or a guest very well acquainted with it." Cynthia pressed her hands to her face. "Then it must have been the punch. Everyone had punch. It could have been any of us. It could have been me. I was standing right by the bowl half the evening, ladling it out." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "But you must consider, my dear, that a great many people had punch from that bowl this evening, and only one glass proved fatal. That suggests to me that the poison was not in the bowl at all, but was added afterward to that one particular glass, which considerably narrows the field of who might have done it, and when. Across the room, Inspector Curtis reappeared in the doorway and requested, in his flat official voice, that Mr. Thomas Carrick step across to the study. Tom went, his face very pale, and was gone perhaps 20 minutes, a long 20 minutes, during which the remaining company sat in a silence so complete that the ticking of the mantel clock seemed unnaturally loud, and Delia Renshaw's hands, folded tightly in her lap, trembled very slightly and would not be still. When Tom returned, he did not sit down again with the others, but went to stand by the window, looking out at the snow with his back to the room, and it was Susan Carrick who was called next. She was gone a shorter time, and came back with her eyes red-rimmed, and sat down beside Cynthia, and would not say a word to anyone. Then Delia Renshaw was called, and her husband made as if to rise and go with her, and was told, gently but firmly, by the constable at the door, that the inspector wished to see Mrs. Renshaw alone. She went white, but went, and Mr. Renshaw sat back down beside the cold chessboard he had abandoned 2 hours before, and stared at the pieces, as though he had forgotten, entirely, what game they had been playing. It was well past 1 in the morning by the time Inspector Curtis had worked his way through the household, and Miss Marple, who had, in the intervening hours, learned a very great deal simply by sitting quietly with her knitting and permitting the frightened, exhausted company to talk near her, as frightened and exhausted people so often will, quite forgetting that a harmless-looking old lady has ears as sharp as anybody's, was not in the least surprised when the inspector, having exhausted his official list, turned his attention to her. "Miss Marple, is it? Mrs. Fortescue tells me you're not a member of the family, just visiting for Christmas." "That is quite correct, Inspector. I am a very old friend of Mrs. Fortescue's, from her time convalescing in my village some years ago." "Then I don't suppose you can tell me much about the family's affairs." "I don't suppose I can," said Miss Marple placidly, "beyond what any observant guest might notice in the course of an evening's conversation. Though I confess, Inspector, that an evening's conversation can be really quite illuminating, if one happens to be paying attention." Something in her tone, mild as it was, caused the inspector to look at her rather more closely than he had troubled to do before. "Go on." "Well," said Miss Marple, setting down her knitting for a moment, with the air of a woman about to say something of no particular consequence, "I could not help but notice, Inspector, that Mr. Selwyn Carrick seemed to derive a very particular pleasure this evening from letting several members of his family and his guests know, not directly, you understand, but by hints, by little remarks, the sort of thing that is really quite as painful as an open accusation, that he knew things about them they would very much rather he did not know. His nephew's debts, or his prospects at any rate, which he threatened more than once this evening to reconsider. His niece's situation, whatever that may prove to be. She said something to me earlier that she stopped herself from finishing, which is always interesting, I find, in a young person who is usually rather too honest for her own comfort. And most particularly, Inspector, I could not help but notice a very pointed remark he made to Mrs. Renshaw and a Mr. Ainsworth before dinner about solicitors' offices and discretion, and a wish to have a word with Mr. Ainsworth before the evening was out. Inspector Curtis had taken out his notebook. "Did he have that word?" "I could not say, Inspector. I was not privileged to overhear it, if it took place. But I should think, if I were investigating a murder committed by poison at a Christmas party, that I should be very interested indeed in whatever word passed, or did not pass, between Mr. Carrick and Mr. Ainsworth in the course of this evening, and very interested too in what it was that Mr. Carrick believed himself to know." The inspector looked at her for a long moment, the look of a professional man revising, somewhat reluctantly, his estimate of an amateur, and then said, "You don't miss much, do you, Miss Marple?" "I am a very old woman, Inspector," said Miss Marple, taking up her knitting again, with a small, deprecating smile, "with very little to do in my village, but watch my neighbours and tend my garden, and I have found, over the years, that the habits of observation one develops over a flower bed apply really quite as well to a drawing room. People, you know, are so very like plants. One learns, after a while, to recognize which ones are rotten at the root, however healthy they may appear above the soil. Though I confess, she added, with the first note of genuine trouble in her mild voice all evening, I had not expected, this Christmas Eve, to find quite so many along one flower bed. The dropped stitch. By the following afternoon, Christmas Day itself, though nobody at Faringdon Hall had much heart left for celebrating it, the snow had stopped. The police surgeon's preliminary findings had confirmed poison as the cause of death, and Inspector Curtis, having established that the fatal dose had been administered to Selwyn Carrick's glass sometime in the 10 or 15 minutes between his leaving the drawing room and Gerald Fortescue's discovery of the body, had settled down to the grim business of establishing exactly who among the household had been unaccounted for during that narrow window of time. It was not, as it turned out, a short list. Tom Carrick had gone, by his own admission, to fetch cigarettes from his room, and had been gone, he thought, some 7 or 8 minutes. Susan Carrick had slipped out to fetch a handkerchief, as she had said in the library doorway, and had been gone rather longer, nearer 15 minutes, by Cynthia's recollection, though Susan herself insisted it could not have been more than 10. Delia Renshaw had gone to the cloakroom to repair her face, and could produce no one to confirm how long she had been about it, her husband having been absorbed the entire time in his chess game with the Colonel. Mr. Ainsworth had stepped out onto the terrace for a cigarette in the cold night air. To clear my head, he told the inspector, rather wretchedly. I needed a moment to think, and had likewise no witness to his movements. Even Dr. Haverford, it emerged upon close questioning, had left the drawing-room briefly to fetch a headache powder from his bag in the hall, though he returned, by general agreement, within some 3 or 4 minutes, which the inspector thought probably too short a window, though he did not entirely discount it. "It is," said Miss Marple, when Cynthia brought her a cup of tea in the small morning room where she had retreated for a little peace. "Really a very awkward sort of problem, is it not? So many people with so very good a reason to slip away for a few minutes at exactly the wrong time, or the right time, I suppose one ought to say, from the murderer's point of view." "I keep thinking it must be Tom," said Cynthia miserably, sinking into the chair opposite. "He had the strongest motive of anyone. Uncle Selwyn's will. You know, he's the principal beneficiary, after myself and Gerald. And Uncle Selwyn was always threatening to cut him out of it entirely. And he was so very angry last night, one could see it." "Yes," said Miss Marple slowly. "I confess I thought so too at first. Anger of that particular white, controlled kind is often exactly the anger that precedes violence. And yet," she paused, frowning a little over her tea, "I find myself troubled by one thing, my dear. A man planning to poison his uncle at a Christmas party in order to inherit before his uncle can alter the will against him is a man who has thought a good deal in advance. The poison, after all, was not a household substance. The police surgeon was quite clear on that point, which means it was brought to this house deliberately by someone who had planned this for rather longer than a single evening's quarrel would account for. And yet Tom Carrick, this very morning, when Inspector Curtis pressed him rather hard on the question of his uncle's threat to alter the will, said something that struck me as very strange indeed, if he were in fact the murderer." "What did he say?" "He said, 'I wish to God he had altered it. I'd rather be poor and rid of the wretched thing than have people thinking what they're plainly thinking now.'" Miss Marple shook her head. "Now, my dear, a guilty man who has committed a very cold and careful murder for the sake of an inheritance does not, as a rule, wish aloud that the inheritance had been taken away from him. It is of course possible that he said it purely for effect, to throw suspicion elsewhere. I have known cleverer criminals attempt just such a thing. But I confess it did not have that ring to me. It had, rather, the ring of a young man who is honestly and bitterly ashamed to be suspected of a crime he did not commit, and who would very much rather be poor and unsuspected than rich and despised by every person who knows him." She sighed. "I own I am not perfectly certain on the point. One's instinct is a very useful thing, my dear, but it is not infallible, and I have been wrong before, quite badly wrong, on 1 or 2 occasions, which I remember still with a good deal of discomfort. So I do not say Tom Carrick is innocent. I say only that I am not yet persuaded of his guilt, and that troubles me, because I had rather expected, this morning, to be persuaded of it, and I am not. Then who? Well, said Miss Marple, setting down her teacup with great precision in its saucer, let us consider, instead, what it is that we actually know, rather than what we merely suspect. We know that Mr. Carrick was poisoned by something added to a fresh glass of punch, poured for him not long before he left the drawing-room. We know that the poison was not a common household substance, which means it was very probably brought into this house by the person who used it, planned, that is to say, in advance, and not seized upon in a moment's fury. And we know, she added, with the faintest deepening of her mild blue eyes, that Mr. Carrick made a habit, throughout the evening, of letting a very particular sort of remark fall. Remarks about solicitors' offices, and discretion, and knowing things, aimed quite deliberately at Mrs. Renshaw and Mr. Ainsworth. You think it was Delia, or Mr. Ainsworth? I think, said Miss Marple carefully, that whatever Selwyn Carrick believed himself to know about those two, it was something of very great seriousness, serious enough that Mrs. Renshaw went white to hear it mentioned even obliquely, and that Mr. Ainsworth, when I observed him afterward, wore the face of a man expecting the roof to fall in upon him. That is not the face of a man merely embarrassed over a flirtation, my dear. That is the face of a man who believes his whole life is about to be taken from him. She was silent a moment. And there is one thing further that troubles me a good deal, though I cannot yet make it fit as neatly as I should like. What is that? Susan, said Miss Marple, that poor frightened girl. She told the inspector she was gone from the drawing-room some 10 minutes, fetching a handkerchief from her own room. And yet, my dear, when she came back into the room after the discovery of the body, I happened to notice that her hands were quite empty. No handkerchief in them at all. Now, that may mean nothing whatsoever. She may simply have left it in her room after all, in the shock of what followed, or used it and put it away again. I do not say it is significant. I only say that I have noticed it, and that I intend to go on noticing it, because in my experience, my dear Cynthia, it is very often the smallest and most unregarded little detail, a handkerchief that was never produced, a glass that was too full when it ought to have been half empty, a word left unfinished in a doorway, that turns out, in the end, to unlock the largest and most terrible of secrets. She rose, gathering her knitting with the unhurried calm of a woman who has, by long practice, learned that murder, like a difficult piece of needlework, is very rarely solved by hurrying, but only by that patient, unglamorous business of picking up one dropped stitch at a time, and following the thread of it, however far it may lead, to wherever it was that someone, in a careless or a frightened moment, first let it fall. I think, she said, that I should very much like to have another word with Susan Carrick, and, I believe, with the maid who poured that final glass of punch. One so easily forgets, in a household of this size, that the people who are paid to be unnoticed very often see a great deal more than anybody troubles to ask them. A very merciful silence. It was Ellen, the young housemaid who had carried round the punch that evening, whom Miss Marple sought out first, finding her below stairs polishing silver with the particular fierce concentration of a servant who wishes very much to appear too busy to be questioned. I wonder, said Miss Marple, settling herself, quite as though she had every right to be there, upon a kitchen stool, whether you happened to notice anyone in the passage between the drawing-room and the library last night, while you were carrying round the punch. Ellen's hands stilled over the silver. I oughtn't to say, miss. The inspector's already asked me everything, and I told him, you told him, I expect, exactly what he asked you, and not one word more, which is very proper of you, and precisely what I should have done in your position. Miss Marple smiled, mild and grandmotherly. But I wonder whether he asked you the right question. Did you happen to see Miss Susan in that passage, carrying anything at all? There was a long pause, and then Ellen said, low, I didn't like to say Miss, because it can't have meant anything, only I did see Miss Susan by the little side table near the library door, and she'd a small dark bottle in her hand, like a medicine bottle, and she put it away quick into her pocket when she saw me coming, and asked me, ever so casual, whether I thought Mr. Carrick would notice if his punch tasted a little different tonight, on account of the spices being stronger this year. And I thought nothing of it, miss. Truly I didn't, only— She stopped, twisting her apron in her hands. Only she asked me something odd, a fortnight back, whether headache powders had much taste, dissolved in a hot drink. I thought she was only asking for herself, on account of her megrims. She does get them something dreadful. Her father, said Miss Marple gently, was in some line of chemistry, I believe. Cynthia mentioned it to me only this morning, that Mr. Carrick's late brother, Susan's father, kept a small apothecary's shop before his debts ruined him. That's right, miss. Miss Susan's got his old case still, in her room. Bottles and scales and I don't know what. Mr. Selwyn used to twit her about it something cruel. Said it was a poor sort of inheritance for a gentleman's daughter, a case of old medicine bottles and nothing else. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, and there was nothing mild in her eyes at all. It was perhaps an hour later that she found Inspector Curtis in Gerald Fortescue's study, going once more through his notes with the dogged, slightly weary patience of a man who suspects he already has the truth in front of him and cannot yet make it hold together. I think, Inspector, said Miss Marple, without preamble, that you had better ask Miss Susan Carrick what her uncle said to her last night by the punch bowl that made her set down her glass and turn away toward the window, and what it was he had arranged for her, after Christmas, that she was not to be permitted a voice in. Susan Carrick, when the inspector sent for her, came into the study white and quiet, and stood before them with the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting, in dread, for exactly this moment, and finds, now that it has come, a kind of terrible relief in no longer having to wait for it. "You knew," she said, looking at Miss Marple, and it was not quite a question. "I suspected, my dear," said Miss Marple, very gently. "There is a great difference. I should be glad, for your own sake, if you would tell us the truth of it now, in your own words, rather than have Inspector Curtis piece it together from the housemaid, and the chemist's case in your room, and the little dark bottle Ellen saw you carrying last night. It will go better for you, I think, told honestly." Susan's hands twisted together before her, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. And then, quite suddenly, as though something long held too tightly had at last given way, she began to speak, in a low, rushing, exhausted voice. "He was going to send me away, after Christmas, to an aunt of his in Yorkshire I have never even met, because I would not agree to marry Mr. Grantley, one of his business associates, a man twice my age whom I cannot bear the sight of. He told me last night, by the punch bowl, as though it were nothing at all, as though he were telling me the time of a train. He said I had eaten his bread for 3 years, and it was time I earned it, and that if I did not do as he wished, I should find myself with no home at all. And he smiled when he said it, and went on filling his glass. And I—" She stopped, pressed a hand to her mouth, and when she went on, her voice had gone very quiet indeed. "I had brought father's old case with me from home. I don't quite know why. Sentiment, I suppose. It was all I had left of him. And there was a bottle in it. I had thought of it before, once or twice, in the dark, the way one thinks of dreadful things one never means to do. But last night, standing there listening to him laugh at me, I found I had already decided, without quite deciding, if you understand me. I followed him to the library on the pretext of the handkerchief. He had set his glass down on the desk while he found his letter paper, and I was only in the room a moment. He didn't even look up. There was a silence in the little study, broken only by the small scratching of Inspector Curtis's pen. "I am not sorry he is dead," said Susan Carrick, very low and very steadily. "I know I ought to be. I only wish I had not had to be the one to do it." It was Dr. Haverford, called in some while later, who spoke gently to her of what would follow, and it was Miss Marple. sitting quietly by the drawing-room fire that evening with her knitting once more in her lap, who explained the whole of it, at Cynthia's tearful request, to the small remaining company. "You must understand," she said, "that Mr. Carrick was, I think, a man who took a very particular pleasure in power, not merely in having it, but in letting the people beneath him feel its weight, quite deliberately, and smile as he did it. Mrs. Renshaw and Mr. Ainsworth had their own trouble with him, I believe, quite separate from Susan's. Some old matter of a will Mr. Ainsworth had once helped to alter, which Mr. Carrick had learned of through his solicitor friends, and threatened to expose, though I understand now it touched no crime, only an old sorrow neither of them wished made public. Tom Carrick had his debts held over him like a rope round the neck, and Susan, poor child, had her very future, her very right to choose whom she might love, bartered away over a Christmas punch bowl as though it were a matter of business, and smiled about, into the bargain." She was silent a moment, her needles still. "We none of us wish to think that murder can walk into a room dressed in holly and candlelight, humming a carol along with the rest of us. But I have found, in a long life, that it very often does exactly that, and that the danger is never in the stranger at the gate, but in the ordinary, familiar unkindness that goes on, year after year, dressed up so prettily in the forms of duty and gratitude and Christmas cheer, that nobody troubles to call it by its true name until it is very much too late." She took up her knitting again, and her voice, when she spoke once more, had softened into something almost sorrowful. "Poor girl! I do not think, whatever the law decides, that she is the only one at fault in this sad business, only the one who, in the end, could bear it no longer, and did the one dreadful thing that all the rest of you, in your different ways, had very nearly wished for, and never quite dared." Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady over Faringdon Hall, covering, as snow will, both the bright and the ugly alike beneath the same white and merciful silence. And Miss Marple, bending once more to her grey wool, thought, not for the first time, that there were a great many kinds of cold in the world, and that the coldest of them all was very rarely found outdoors at all.